Tonight's lecture is How the Sausage Gets Made, presented by our very own Columbia College Chicago's Associate Professor of Fine Arts, Taylor Hokanson. Following Taylor's talk, we're going to have a reception in the Community Engagement Hub, the room right behind our lecture hall here. Please stick around for that. We have omnivore and veggie vegan friendly options for you. Taylor will present the sabbatical research he conducted at ADEMA University in Mallorca, Spain. During his time abroad, he took inspiration from public festival culture and hyperlocal sausage-making traditions. The culmination was a performance and multimedia installation that connected these ancient practices with Chicago's more recent history of meatpacking, house music, open outcry stock trading, and more. Over the course of a 20-year career, Taylor's artwork has been exhibited at international venues such as Ars Electronica in Austria, SIGGRAPH in Vancouver, IC in Hong Kong, and TechFest in Mumbai. His research agenda explores the social implications of post-digital technology and the cross-cultural symbolism of cured meat. Let's give a warm welcome to our colleague, friend, and Associate Professor Taylor Hokanson.
I hear some good energy out there, so thanks for having me. I'm going to talk about my sabbatical research and then also some projects I've been getting into since I got back from Spain about, I think it was 8 months ago or so. This project came kind of to an end, but now it's also got this long tail that's moving out into future work. Let's get going. So when I'm talking about this project, the first question a lot of my colleagues was asking me was why Mallorca? I think when it comes to the Balearic Islands, most people are familiar, if at all, they're familiar with Ibiza, which is right next to Mallorca. And the reason was it was a complete accident. When I was the interim associate chair in the departments, there were a couple of people from not exactly a new school, but a new program in Mallorca that actually started as a dental college and a dietary sciences degree. And they wanted to move into an art degree. So it was this really unusual pairing. And they were actually in town for Expo. I think this was either 3 or 4 years ago. So they were calling around to different art programs and asking to come through and see how we were working. So I invited them in. And we bought a case of beer, and then we went to Mana and just had a really great series of conversations. So this is Diego Gonzalez on the left. He's the president at ADEMA University in Mallorca. And then Amparo Sard is one of the primary artists that works in that program. They were in town for her project called the Haptic NFT. So she had taken a look at some of the really incredible technology they were using in dental sciences. They had this VR setup, so you would put on a VR helmet and then use a stylus that would track your hand movements through space. And then you would actually have a little virtual patient and you would go in there and chip away at their teeth and that kind of stuff. So she was using that device to take 3D scan of her own body, like a bust, and to carve away at it with this dental technology. And then somehow NFTs were involved. I was a little unsure about the nature of the project, but because I also work in artwork that gets outside of the art world a little bit and into the industrial space and the technology space, it seemed like a natural fit. And one thing I was really interested to find about Spanish business culture is it was so much about the relationships first. So the fact that we went out to Mana and hung out and drank a case of beer, that was actually kind of my interview. And so we had such a good time together that they just said, yeah, if you want to do a project, just let us know. So it wasn't like looking on Instagram, for a call for proposals or something. It was really starting with the relationship and then taking things from there. So when I started thinking about proposing a project in Mallorca, I was trying to think about what the island is known for. It started as an agrarian space, and then now it's mostly tourism driven in terms of its economy. But it's a really cool spot. The three things I think most people know are all the way on the right, the olives, Spanish olives, then also the island is almost entirely made out of sandstone. So a lot of the buildings you find on the island were based on quarries that are found all around the perimeter. And then you just bring that stone inward and build cathedrals and that sort of thing. And then finally, Iberican ham. So they're very famous for, variants of, I guess it wouldn't be called prosciutto, but effectively prosciutto and cured meats and sausages and that kind of thing. So they had all these natural materials. And then also in terms of the cultural material I wanted to take advantage of, they have this really wonderful tradition of demonies. So it's a very small island with a bunch of little tiny sub-communities. And for the Festival of Saint Anthony, which happens in mid-January, they try to recreate this biblical story moment when St. Anthony was in his hermitage out on the edge of town, and then these demons went out and tried to convince him to renounce Christianity. The way it was described to me was that in mainland Spain, it's a little bit more chaste, and so you would just have the demons go forth and kind of yell at St. Anthony or threaten St. Anthony, but it was described to me that on the island, the story was told where the demons were kind of sexy, so the demons were trying to convince St. Anthony to renounce his holy ways that way. And the way that St. Anthony gets his mind off of that is to walk on a bed of hot coals, So you have these different versions of the story spreading out that are colored by the local culture. So what you see down here, the words that you're seeing are these different towns, some of which are quite small throughout the island of Mallorca. And each of them, even within that island, have their own way of making these demon masks for this celebration. That was not something that was new to me. I've always been really interested in this idea of syncretism and the way in particular that Judeo-Christian religions, when they spread out through the world, were encountering other kinds of faith traditions and not demanding that they go away wholesale, but sort of absorbing some of those stories into their own. So this is an example here of the gelling stones, which I believe are in Denmark. I think I'm having trouble reading my notes at the same time. But Harold Bluetooth famously was the one that brought together all these warring factions in the region and then Christianized them. I believe they were, Denmark. I'm seeing it in my notes here right now. So the gelling stones he built are these enormous stones that you can go visit. And on the left-hand side, you can see an example of Jesus's crucifixion, but it's being framed as though Jesus is crucified on Yggdrasil, which is that world tree that's coming from that earlier faith tradition. And on the right, you get the more sort of earlier examples of that culture. And it's so interesting to consider, right, as you think about these stories. We all know that flood myths, for example, occur in essentially every world culture. On the left here, we're looking at an example of Odin. And when Odin was seeking out these magical powers or this greater knowledge of runes, he had himself, I believe it was hung from the world tree. He also is pierced in the side with a spear, and I think has to pluck out one of his eyeballs or something like that. I forget the specifics of the story in their entirety. And then we also have a sort of false color version, a reproduction of one of the gelling stones, which I believe is more accurate to how it originally looked. So I love this idea of these stories that really clearly ignite the imagination and people find them really important to their faith tradition. And we don't want to necessarily completely make a right turn and change as new ideas come in. So those ideas get remixed in a way. And indeed, if we think about this in terms of contemporary technology, we've all used Bluetooth. So Bluetooth is coming from the name of this guy, Harold Bluetooth, who Christianized and united all of these different factions into what we now know as Denmark. And if you think about that conceptually, the authors are picking him because we're trying to bring together all of these different technological communication systems in the digital age, and you're trying to unite them so that they all communicate with the same language, right? So that's the reference right there. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, he was called Bluetooth because he had a tooth with a dead root or something that just looked like it was blue, but that might be apocryphal. So in this context, I was also thinking about books that were really important to me when I was growing up and getting into science fiction, which I still am today. But you can't really reproduce that first time that you read Gibson's Neuromancer or Snow Crash or something like this. Now, of course, when you go back to these books, a book like Snow Crash is highly problematic in terms of some of the sex politics that it has. But it's really one of the first times that everybody is reading about, or at least nerds are all reading about, the idea of virtual reality and, for example, a virtual planet that you could occupy. And indeed, what we come to find out later is that there are this whole generation of tech workers that were reading these books at the same time in the 90s. And then they're the ones that go work at Google and make Google Earth exist. This is also, I believe, where the term metaverse is coined. And so you had somebody like Zuckerberg is reading about this and then bizarrely finds himself in the position to set a match to $40 billion worth of tech development when, of course, the metaverse just kind of came and went and nobody really cared about it. The other really ironic thing about this, which is so funny, is your Elon Musks and your Zuckerbergs and so on, they're reading these books and the message that they take out of it is, I really want to make that happen. Whereas almost universally, all these books are saying, this is a terrible idea. Please do not be. So they're very dystopian novels, but these kind of technology bros completely miss the point. They miss the artistic thrust of the book, and they just see the kind of gross description of the technology and want it to be recreated. So that's getting me thinking about the way that culture shifts on its way through technology and how some things are lost and some are gained. This was just a little reference for my Catalan speakers when I was giving a version of this talk in Mallorca. And so, yeah, high and low culture kind of coexisting at the same time. So I was trying to figure out, the first time I went to Mallorca, I was just there for 3 weeks. My hosts at ADEMA were gracious enough to give me a place to stay and a place to work. At the same time, they didn't know exactly what to do with me because I wasn't applying for a really distinct artist residency. So it wasn't like they had this expectation that I would come in and work on a printing press or some other distinct piece of technology. So at first, I was just trying to exist in the island and be influenced by the things that I found there. And when I started thinking about pigs, which is now just a complete obsession of mine, I found this particular boar or pig where it has these tusks that if they're not worn down actively by the animal, they can actually grow back and penetrate the eye or even the brain of the animal and kill it. So you had this sort of funny, to me it's funny, I guess not funny for the pig, but you had this funny thing about evolution trying to get you to this particular spot where there is a solution to this, but if you're not careful, there's this fact of the organic reality. The body of the pig is kind of self-defeating. And I was thinking about those technologies like social media and these other things that kind of solve a problem, but cause way more problems than they solve. So then I was also trying to figure out what sort of equipment, much like Amparo had been doing when she made the digital NFT, I was trying to figure out how to take advantage of a school that had a ton of really amazing high-tech dental gear, but was still growing in terms of its art offerings. And then Diego was nice enough to give me some time where his lab workers, these experts that were making true orthotic gear for people's mouths, they did a 3D scan of my jaws and my teeth, and then they fabricated this device that just clicked right up into my teeth, so it fit like an actual medical device. And they were really worried about it too, because when I put it in, they were just imagining someone kind of hauling on one of those horns and just popping all my teeth out. But this thing was great. So when I would put it in, it kind of made me think about that boar. And it made me think about the way that technology is often built, especially right now, where it's kind of in search of a problem. And then, in fact, it creates those problems. It then goes on to maybe solve or maybe not. I'm thinking about, AI and all those related ills. And so similarly here, I was thinking about my sort of cis white tech bro body and then creating this technological experience that maybe, as horns do in nature, it was projecting my masculinity out into a space using these kind of white technology branded colors, but at the same time was clearly reducing my capability to feed myself and survive. So this was the first project. I was super psyched about how that went, and then I had this opportunity to do a sabbatical project. So that was 3 weeks, and the next one that I pitched was 3 months long. And in the process of thinking about what I would do next, I was looking at some of the thematic materials, the syncretism I talked about already, and the way that those stories kind of blend together and mesh. The ownership of public space, animals, agriculture, meat, ritual I have highlighted because that one became hugely important. The social impact of technology, and then permanence and impermanence. So the great thing about a sabbatical project, and it's so hard to get access to these kinds of experiences, where you can truly just take the time to think about something before you react to it as an artist. It's so hard to do that in 2026, right? But knowing I had 3 months in front of me, actually was able to take some of those initial weeks and just walk around and collect a whole bunch of information. And one of the great things I saw, in addition to the demonias that I knew a little bit about, was how many paper masks papier-mâché masks I would find around the island. And I would be walking around and I would just kind of encounter them at random because they were such a common thing to do for all sorts of different public rituals in Mallorca. So these were all masks that I saw, or two different kinds of masks that I saw at one of the government buildings at the center of town. In the center, you have an example of a gigante. So when this costume was put on, I think the person's head only came up to the bottom of that drum. So they were these maybe 10 or 12 feet tall costumes of figures in traditional garb that would go sort of walking around the city. And then on the left and the right, these would be more like cabezudos, so these sort of giant head figures. And then for people in Mallorca, they know all about all the stories that are connected to each of these. So this was more sort of a demoni figure. I'm not exactly sure what the lion guy was all about. At one point, too, because Mallorca is a tourist island, I had this great experience where the gigante was walking through the central square, and then there was a contemporary performer that was dressed up as the Transformer Bumblebee, and he was out there popping and locking for tourists, and then this guy was walking by, and they were kind of doing the same thing, but just sort of, 300 years apart. So I started seeing these things, getting really inspired. I also went to this great show that was way out in the middle of nowhere at this place called Factoria Sa. And so I got to see these awesome rock bands that were mixing together traditional instrumentation. And then apparently it was also highly political because I don't speak Catalan. A friend I was there with had to keep telling me, like, don't applaud during this part because this is actually like really intense political discussion that you don't know anything about. The music was great, and it was great to be in that atmosphere. And I was told that they were going to be demonis, right? Because the whole thing with this project was that I was going to finish it in January, but the demoni performances happen at least throughout the cold months of the year. And I was so excited to get pictures of them, but it was getting later and later, and I had to catch my last train out or else I was going to be stranded and just have to like stay awake all night. So I waited and waited, and they kind of got later and later. And then the demonis started to come out. So often there's like a backup band with the demonis that are playing percussion. It was very evocative. It was taking time. And then with like 10 minutes to go, I snapped this one picture of these guys blowing fire. And then I just ran to the train station, and I had to do it on the side of the highway. So I was running down the highway and there were no street lights, and I had my phone turned to flashlight and I was waving it over my head and then just running so that I wouldn't be like hit by a car. So I had this very brief encounter with them and was excited for more. So that's the demoni piece. And then, yes, pigs are important on the island, but the other thing I started noticing was that there were just all of these references and visual material in the main city of Palma to animals as well. And I think like Chicago, Chicago, of course, not New York, not LA. I feel like farms are just so close by, but when we're actually in the city, it's so hard to get access to that origin as a place with, animals and nature and so forth. And I think one of the ways they dealt with that in Palma is just to have depictions of animals all over the place. So that's a car wash in the lower right. Second from the right on the top is this massive granite sculpture of a pigeon. That's just great. That bull is a painting that you encounter right when you get into the airport. And also their caution, dangerous dog signs are generally hand-painted tiles that are embedded in the fence outside the house. So lots of these kinds of references to animals. And then there was also a really, really active graffiti scene. And while I'm not personally a graffiti writer, it's something I tend to follow a lot. And I was thinking about my experiences in St. Louis in particular with Paint Louis. I don't know if anyone knows that organization. I know one or two of you do. Chicago, of course, has a lot of graffiti going on. But apart from those giant one-off murals on the side of a business, I feel like Chicago is largely focused on name writing. Whereas in Mallorca, so much of it was, here's an animal, and then here's like a little tiny signature down at the bottom. And then some of these people I started getting really excited about finding more of their work. So I believe that's Bernie Chulo down there in the lower right, who we'll talk about a little bit more too. And then as a subset of these, I'm also really fascinated about marketing that involves animals that are really enthusiastic about you eating them, right? So this was some of those examples, but like the chicken in particular, I was pretty psyched about. Yeah, so here's Bernie Chulo. So in terms of artists I was encountering while I was there, I thought that he was really exciting. This is this massive, like 10 by 20 foot mural I found of, this pig boy saying like, "Oh, it's so delicious. It's so rich." This presumably ham sandwich that he was about to eat. And then for anyone that hasn't, I don't know why I'm framing it that way, because I can't imagine anyone has encountered this particular artist, but her name is Yuitha Ferber-Bautha, and I'm happy to spell that out if anyone's interested. But her work just completely blew my mind. And she was like a queer political activist, kind of punk rock poster designer. And so all of her work was just all over town. But check out that one on the right? So you have like the art historical references and the, dissing the adolescent gym bros and the sort of like toxic masculinity culture. And she's down there. That's a self-portrait of her breaking a fascist symbol with her pencil. And then here she is, criticizing the United States warmongering well before we got into Iran and Trump was reelected and so forth. She was one of the people that I really wanted to reach out to while I was there, and I was really nervous because a big part of her practice deals with criticizing tourism within Mallorca. So one thing I was trying to really focus on was I'm here to learn and I'm here to be very serious about this. And when I did finally reach out, she was so nice and very, very welcoming, which of course. Here's also coming back to that sandstone I was talking about earlier. So the quarries that dot, I think there's hundreds of them effectively that dot Mallorca all over the place, are so soft that you can come up there with a key or something like that and inscribe graffiti. So in addition to what we understand as graffiti today, contemporary graffiti, there's also a bunch of this great writing, and you could never tell how old it was. It could be, hundreds of years old in some cases. Now, all the cathedrals are also made out of the same stone, so they are just absolutely covered in this inscribed graffiti, which I thought was a cool way of people reclaiming those public spaces. So back to Chicago, what this got me thinking of was, who knows what this is? The Chicago rat hole. Now, potentially, I think scientists have determined that it's a squirrel, but it doesn't matter, right? It's the rat hole. So I was trying to think of our similar yearning in Chicago for the natural world. We have these, coyotes that sometimes come in from the suburbs and walk down along the train tracks and then go try to get a sandwich at a Pret Manger. Am I pronouncing that right? But, the Chicago rat hole is one of these great examples where we all just decided this was a good idea and it's ridiculous, but we got to have an animal contact somehow. So here's just a brief example.
Well, it's not hard to spot the Chicago rat hole. All you have to do is look for the people who are staring down at the sidewalk, and it's those crowds that are part of the problem. For years, some neighbors in Roscoe Village have called this rodent-shaped crater on the West Roscoe Street sidewalk a squirrel imprint.
I've been living here for probably 20 years, and it was there already.
For the past couple of weeks, it's been going by a new name, the Chicago rat hole.
Some guy took a photo of it and posted it on Twitter, I think, and then it blew up.
And since then, the hole has attracted people by the hundreds. It's been the site of an engagement, and it's even served as a wedding venue. This couple marking the occasion with something else only Chicagoans can appreciate.
Oh, there's Malort? You have to do Malort.
Go for it. Go for it.
But neighbors are growing tired of the constant crowds, late-night parties, and what some people leave behind.
They've been leaving food around, and that attracts actual rats.
I really feel bad for the people that live right in front of it. They've had to deal with a lot of challenges.
Ryan Martin says he has to deliver the mail for those neighbors because the mail carriers can't always access their building. That's why Alderman Scott Waguespack tells WGN News he's considering having the sidewalk slab removed entirely, potentially even giving it away or raffling it off if the hoopla on West Roscoe doesn't calm down.
I can see why they've been annoyed by it.
Should I get beyond that? So that was so inspiring to me. And one thing I really love about our city, and I really want to see more about when I'm speaking about this idea of ritual, that people I think are so desperate to get together in the same physical space and have a shared interest in almost anything, right? So Malort gets celebrated, even though a lot of people think it tastes gross. I think just because it's a thing everyone feels like they share. It's a local thing. We can have the dibs debate, for example, in here. And I love the fact that people would travel to that sidewalk tile to get married, and it was so busy that the city eventually had to remove the sidewalk tile. They didn't destroy it, but they took it to a secret location. And then there was some question as to whether it'll be auctioned off. Owner, do you have more information about it? It's in the mayor's office. Right. So how amazing is that? So it's really just everyone deciding we're all gonna think this is cool, and we're all gonna walk in the same direction. And there's something super beautiful about that requires almost nothing to be there, right? You can just kind of make this out of thin air. Here's another example of a local artist everyone should look up if you don't know him, Derek Erdman. If anyone lives in Logan Square, there's a particular business that's right next to Lula where he's always posting wheat paste posters. But he went ahead and made a inversion of the Target Rats poster. So this is the official one on the left. And then on the right, he's encouraging everybody towards bad behavior, but he's got a lot of that stuff. Derek Erdman. Also Jim Bashore, I'm not super big fan of, who goes around and makes mosaics that he installs inside of potholes, effectively fixing the pothole and then not asking permission. So he has this little reflective vest, he has his little cones, and now I think he's kind of known well enough that police just see him and they might even recognize him, but then they don't bother him. So he's found this great kind of niche, and then his pothole mosaics sell for thousands of dollars. Sometimes people will go, I think, and even try to steal them. But sometimes you can see these around town as well. That's FBAPHOR. And then this is what I refer to as the Salt Stain Mary. I don't know if there's really like a technical term for it. I think Our Lady of the Underpass is another one, but this is in I think it's in Logan Square at Fullerton, where it comes and goes. So one of the things about it is I think it's based on a crack that descends down through the foundation of the overpass. And so salt would come down and leach out. And then someone decided that had the rough outline of a person, in a hood. And then people started creating this altar down at the bottom of it. I think some people would then come and deface it, and then people would deface the defacement. And now there's a whole 3-act play that they do about Our Lady of the Underpass and so forth. So there's all these examples that we're just so desperate, give us community, give us something that we can all kind of come together and rally around, and we can, find a story in anything, even just like a salt stain on the wall. And then if you pull that history a little bit further back, some of the other things I was thinking about was that what previously defines downtown Chicago was meatpacking. And if you look kind of up there in the center, you can kind of make out the word armor. Is my cursor working? Yeah, somewhere right around there. But armor meatpacking, right? And we're talking about a little more than 100 years ago. Was really one of the biggest businesses there was. You had to be on water originally to transport your goods around, but then the big thing that armor brought in was refrigerated rail cars. So this was this brand new technology, and suddenly you could centralize the place where you were slaughtering animals, where it didn't have to happen on individual farms, and then you could spread out from there. And then that efficiency would drive down the cost and also give more people access to that kind of protein. And it's pretty shocking how industrialized it got so long ago. So at the height, I think it was something like 7 or 9 million animals or something are being processed a year. And then what they would do is bring the rail car in at the top of this building, a specialized building. The animals would come out and then get broken down as they made their way through the building, kind of fed by gravity. And then at the bottom of the building, all of the products would come out there. It was kind of a disassembly line. And indeed, Ford came to visit and looked at that and had the idea for the assembly line. And that's kind of where industrialized car manufacture takes place. So we can owe car basis, the highway basis of America in some ways to this meatpacking origin. At the same time, you had the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, which originally was just there for people to trade butter and milk and things like that. So you had these agrarian products that were going to spoil really fast. And so people would come together for some reason in these octagon battle pits. They decided that was the shape, of the mercantile exchange. And that's where they would decide, somebody wants to buy butter, somebody wants to sell butter. This has to happen super fast before that material goes bad. And then 100 years later, Chicago, I forget the date that it shut down, but eventually computers just catch up with our way of doing commodity exchanges, and it's no longer effective for humans to do it. But for the longest time, we had this open outcry system. And you've seen this reproduced in Ferris Bueller, for example. They go and look at the commodities exchange. And there was even there was a style of dress. So there's a very particular open outcry dress. There was an architectural space that you would occupy. And then also there was an entire sign language. So people from across the room, there would be the symbol for buy and the symbol for sell was based on how you oriented your palms. The number of fingers you had would be multiples of 10 and so forth, depending on where you touched your hand on your body. And then if you see video of this, which I don't have, but people are just screaming out and doing these kind of this sign language that's specific to this very, very specific undertaking. So computers kind of kill the whole thing, but you can get a sense there just how chaotic and wild it was. Yeah, so I'm thinking about these things that are sort of inherent to Chicago. Chicago has this rule, no ketchup on hot dogs. And if you try to get it at the Wiener Circle, they ask you if you're a child, and like, I don't particularly subscribe to that one, but, some people really enjoy that kind of like, there's a right way to do things and a wrong way to do things. And then just as an aside, because part of my family on my wife's side is coming from Taiwan, I was also starting to think about other cultures that I could even mix in. And there was this whole sort of research arm that got into how the Monkey King, is anyone in here playing a Black Myth Wukong? Right. Anyway, there's some video game references to this recently, but this is a classic, historically classic myth that happens in China about the Monkey King and search for salvation, that sort of thing. But he brings along his second in command, Pigsy. I'm going to need help on the pronunciation. Subaji, who is kind of famous for having too many carnal desires, right? And so apparently he's the god that you see represented by sex workers in Taiwan, right? Because they want to like celebrate Johns coming in and having, indulging in their carnal passions to a too great a degree. But I'm going to have to save that one for later because now I'm putting too much into the same project. Okay, so back to Mallorca, and I'm trying to figure out what I'm going to do. One of the local materials that I'm reading about is wool, and I got to go out to a wool manufacturing plant called La Natura or Ya Natura that is working with local wools that come in these three very distinct colors. They're working on this machine for carting out the wool that's more than 100 years old and like super dangerous. And so I started working on this little object. I found that as I was working on it, 3 months was not going to be enough time to achieve the scale that I was looking for, but I like the little maquette, how it came out. And so what I started working towards is these masks. And so I started getting in there and trying to figure out what's the kind of basis for like a pig mask going to be. When I've been going to these different events, I would see characters of all different types, the Capazudos, the Gigantes, and so forth. But I just never saw a pig represented, which I thought was really surprising. So I tried to put some of the research I was doing into that cultural performance and ritual that I was observing. These are just some more shots of this pig mask kind of coming together. So my eyes were right around here. So I think the overall height of the costume is maybe like 8 or 9 feet tall. And I was just working. It was also useful, right? Because my second time through, I couldn't depend on 3 months worth of dedicated dental technician time to help me realize some kind of sculpture. So I was trying to take a little bit of pressure, off the institution and do something with found material. So this is all recycled cardboard, white glue. I think the black you're seeing is one of my friend's old bed sheets that he donated. And at the same time, I'm trying to go to more St. Anthony performances because now we're getting closer and closer to January. So for this one, I went out to this really tiny little town. The bus let me off again in a place that was completely pitch black. And let me turn that down a little bit. So if you watch over on the left-hand side, this kid gets snatched and then they pretend to throw him on the bonfire. So the funny thing about asking about this, right, a lot of my hosts thought it was funny that I was asking because they regarded the Festival of St. Anthony as kind of being for kids. And it was this sort of Halloween-y thing. Sometimes you'd see kids dressed up as these demons and stuff. Some of the kids were in on the joke. Some of the kids were not in on the joke. So when the demons would come out, they would pretend to rip the child out of their parents' grasp, and the parents would be kind of laughing behind their hands. And some of the kids were super freaked out by it. But it was kind of a rite of passage, and of course nobody ever got harmed or really thrown on the fire. And then after that big bonfire was done, they would rake up the coals and then put them in all these little barbecue stations, and then everyone would share this big communal meal. And this is happening all over the island at different points in time. It was so beautiful. It was great. So I was trying to figure out sort of how to integrate myself in a way that didn't just feel like I was a tourist, but I was really studying the culture and so forth. I tried to go to a matanzas, which is the kind of ritual slaughtering of a pig on a family farm, but I couldn't quite make that happen. I made myself this big cape and designed this fabric where the pattern is itself sort of like the organs that you would use to make sausage. And then this is a really traditional kind of rake called a forca, a Mallorca forca, that's actually grown out of one single plant. And they just kind of train those branches with rope and stuff. And when they cut it down, it's just a little pitchfork. So I was going to perform this thing along with the show where I performed it around a bonfire. I also did this 3-channel video series. I'm kind of running out of time to show everything, so I'll just give you kind of a brief example of that. But this was this one video I produced about sort of the movements of culture, one culture digesting another, the endless sausage and so forth. I think the next step is it needs to have some real earthy sound to go with it. And then this was the final results. It's my big man. I called the piece El Bispe, or the Bishop, because when you're making this traditional sausage, sobrasada sausage, you actually use many different organ meats from the animal, including the stomach. And the stomach being so large, when it's packed with meat to cure, it takes the entire year to cure. So some of those skinny sausages cure pretty fast and you can eat them more quickly. But you would have to put up El Bispe, the stomach sausage, for a full year. And then at the next year's matanzas, you take it down and carve a slice out of it and give it to the kind of guest of honor, or grandma or whoever it would happen to be. And so the day of the actual performance was super wild and crazy. Mallorca is just so small and a lot of people know each other. So fortunately, I was the guy who was in charge of the pottery area of the school, had also spent a lot of time working in the government. So he knew how to order a bonfire. And it's a thing that city does, that you order either a half-ton or a full-ton bonfire. You just send them an email and they just drop off a ton of wood. And this is happening all over the city. And so when we installed it, it was really close to the building. So if you think about just the sidewalk, and then it was right off the curb, and we were all kind of looking at it like, is this going to be all right? And he said, come on, I've done this 1,000 times. And of course it was fine, but it was a huge bonfire. What you also see is my colleague, Dan Norton. I'd helped them set up a little foundry setup, which is similar to what my students are working on right now in sculpture. And so he set up a green screen. We just kind of did everything at once. So he had this kind of multimedia thing going on where he was recording a green screen and then putting animated images of sausage behind the students doing metal casting and that kind of stuff. And then, the performance itself was also sort of wild and crazy because it's just kind of out here in the streets. But you can sort of get a sense of how giant that fire was there. And then after all this was done, so particularly with the pizza next door, but everybody is so into house music in Mallorca, and I'm talking all ages. And it was really fun to be able to say, you guys realize that's a Chicago thing through and through, and then we exported it to the world. So there was this really wonderful closing of that loop where we had some traditional music that would normally go with one of these bonfires, and then also house music, and we're eating barbecue together and kind of celebrating. It was great. So just to give you a little, I'm going to wrap up here, but a sense of where some of these projects are going now that I'm coming back. One of the ideas with a sabbatical is that we go out there as faculty to find information to bring back to the students to enrich this institution. And so these are some of the ways that I'm trying to do that, mix together my teaching practice with my research practice. I don't know if anybody, I think some of you have, but if anyone got a chance to use my height striker, or the kind of strength testing carnival device that Manifest last year, I cast this enormous kind of Wallace and Gromit, pig demon, Indonesian-inspired head. I was mixing together a bunch of bits of research I was doing, and this goes as the topper to the high striker. I'm going to show a new and improved version of this at this year's Manifest at 11th and Wabash, and so I want to encourage you guys to come check it out. But this is just the casting that's at the top from the faculty show. This is an example of how it operates. And so it also shoots fire out of the top. And if I have to explain why, then all is lost. So this Hive Striker, this is kind of in keeping, I think a lot of my practice has been really moving towards spectacle. And I think in the fine arts, we can kind of look down on spectacle a little bit because it feels unserious. But I remember having this, one time there was a student that was asking me questions about my work when I was interviewing for a fellowship. And they said, so everything you make is silly. And I said, no, everything I make is absurd. And let me show you why that's an interesting distinction. So I feel like the absurdity and that joy, we should be making work that feels good to interact with. And there's a ton of bad stuff happening out there in the world, don't get me wrong, and we need to address all of this with art. But I want to make sure that at least that initial experience somebody has is they feel welcomed in, and then we can really get down into, say, for example, the discussion around masculinity or whatever that you might have with a piece like this. So the Hive Striker was one example, that sort of carnival aesthetic. I also co-taught with Aaron McCarthy last year, a big Chicago class, and then we participated in Arts in the Dark, which is the city's giant pre-Halloween parade. So I was trying to teach my students how to make masks that were inspired by the stockyards, like I was just talking about. They could make a bull, a sheep, or a pig skull. And then I think we were about 50 people. So we made up this giant group that was kind of inspired by those Demoni performances, but with this very distinctly Chicago flavor. And then I don't know if they have a count yet for last year, but they said that routinely this parade gets about 100,000 people. We're going to be doing this again next semester and hopefully even bigger. So if anyone's interested in participating in something like that, come seek me out and we'll find a way to get you involved. So Arts in the Dark is another one. Here's some example of some student work from that turned out great. Yeah, and just to wrap it up, I think I talked about some of this stuff, but Manifest Hive Striker Part 2 is going to be at Manifest on Saturday, May 16th, also my birthday. I'm going to be participating in some steamroller printmaking, right, where we cut out big printing plates, 3x6 foot printing plates on the CNC machine in 623, and then print them out on bed sheets with a literal steamroller at Sputnik Press at the end of May. That's something that people can come check out as well. Red Bull is going to have people build sculptures around tandem bicycles and drive them on a track that's built up out of the water at the lake in Grant Park. I think that way. It's a free event and there's supposed to be 25,000 people in the audience. And so if we're lucky, some of students that I was working with will get their proposals selected and then they'll be on TV, that giant group of people. And then there's a whole other project I didn't really get a chance to talk about. Maybe some of you participated, but I've had some of my students working with students from Poland and Spain towards collaborative projects that they send through the mail. And I'm going to be presenting the results of that research in Madrid. That exhibition took some of our student work to Poland, Spain, Chicago. It may still be in the Student Center, and also Nairobi, because why not? Finally, Arts in the Dark is coming up, next October, but you got to start planning for this stuff well in advance. So that's my dance card so far, but hopefully, I don't know, let's put some more stuff on there. Yeah, so thanks a lot. This is my website and also my Instagram handle, and then I'm just Hokanson at colum.edu if anybody wants to reach out, and thank you for listening.